A garbage collector stopped to help an elderly man in distress without knowing who he was. When the man showed up at his work the next day, he couldn't believe what was happening. Tyrone's alarm went off at 4 a.m., its shrill beeping echoing through the tiny apartment. He reached out and slapped it quiet, eyes still half closed. The early morning was dark, cold, and uninviting, just like every other day. He sat up slowly, letting out a deep breath, and glanced over at his wife, Latasha. She was asleep, her breathing soft but strained. Tyrone frowned, noticing the empty bottle of medicine on her nightstand. He grabbed it, turning it over in his hand, knowing full well what it meant. Another trip to the pharmacy, another expense he could barely afford. He got dressed in the semi-darkness, pulling on his orange uniform, freshly washed, like always. It was his pride. He took a last look at his two kids, Devin and Kayla, sleeping soundly in the room they shared, surrounded by their school books and worn-out posters. He walked over to Kayla and pulled the blanket over her shoulder before stepping out quietly. The weight of their needs rested heavily on his chest. In the kitchen, Tyrone saw the white envelope, the landlord's notice of rent increase. It stared back at him, demanding an answer. He shook his head, pushing it aside, and made his way out the door. Outside, the chill of the early morning struck him instantly, and he zipped up his jacket. At work, Tyrone climbed into his garbage truck, started the engine, and got on his route. The streets of Oakbrook were mostly empty at this hour, just the way he liked it. He moved through the neighborhoods, the hum of the truck the only sound for blocks. He picked up trash cans, emptying them into the back of the truck, one after the other, his body moving mechanically as he worked. "Yo, Ty, you good?" called out Jamal, his partner for the morning shift, as they pulled into a street. Tyrone forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm all right. Just another day, you know," he replied, keeping his eyes on the road, his mind already counting how many hours were left until he'd be home again. They moved on, stopping at their usual points, keeping a rhythm. Everything was predictable until Tyrone turned a corner and saw something that pulled him out of his routine. There, struggling to push a shopping cart up a steep incline, was an elderly man. His frame was bent with effort, his hands trembling over the cart's handle. Tyrone pulled the truck to the side of the road. "What are you doing, Ty?" "We're behind already, man," Jamal complained, shaking his head. "Just give me a sec," Tyrone replied, ignoring the frustration in Jamal's voice. He opened the door and hopped out, jogging across the street to where the old man stood. "Hey there, sir. You need a hand with that?" Tyrone asked, keeping his voice calm and friendly. The old man looked up, startled for a second, then nodded gratefully. "If you could, son, these wheels ain't what they used to be," he said, his breath labored. "Don't worry about it. I got you," Tyrone assured him. He took the cart from the man's hands, feeling the weight of it, as he began pushing it up the slope. It was heavier than it looked. He glanced over at the old man, noticing his tired eyes and the worn-out coat he wore. "You live nearby?" Tyrone asked as they walked. "Just around that corner," the old man replied. "Bless you, young man. Most folks just drive by." "Well, everybody needs a hand sometimes," Tyrone replied, giving a small nod. He kept pushing until they reached the house the old man pointed out, a modest single-story place with faded paint. He helped get the cart up to the doorstep. "Thank you. I really mean it," the man said, fumbling in his pocket. "I wish I had something to give you." Tyrone shook his head. "No need, sir. Just take care of yourself, all right?" He turned and jogged back toward the truck. Jamal was tapping his fingers impatiently on the dashboard. "Bro, you know we got a schedule, right?" he snapped when Tyrone climbed back in. Yeah, let's go," Tyrone replied, avoiding Jamal's glare as they got back on the route. The silence between them was tense. Tyrone felt it weighing on him, the sense that he'd messed up somehow, even though he knew he'd done the right thing. When they reached the next stop, he noticed the supervisor's car parked nearby, his figure standing next to it with his arms crossed. Tyrone's stomach tightened. "Here comes trouble," Jamal muttered, shaking his head. The supervisor, Mr. Collins, approached the truck as Tyrone stepped out. His face was set in a frown. "Tyrone, what's going on? You're already late on your route," he said, his tone stern. "I had to help someone, Mr. Collins. Just a quick thing. An old man needed help getting his cart home," Tyrone explained. Mr. Collins sighed, rubbing his temple. Look, Tyrone, I get it. You got a good heart, but you can't let it interfere with work. We've got routes to finish, and I don't have to tell you what happens if we don't. Tyrone nodded, feeling the sting of the words. Understood, sir. Won't happen again. Make sure it doesn't, Mr. Collins said before walking away. Back in the truck, Jamal shook his head again. Man, you got to stop doing that stuff. People don't care, Ty. They just don't. Tyrone didn't answer. He looked straight ahead, gripping the wheel. He knew Jamal was probably right, but the look in that old man's eyes stuck with him. It wasn't something he could just ignore. The rest of the shift dragged on. Every time Tyrone saw the clock, the pressure tightened around his chest. The day didn't let up. Garbage bins, routes, cold wind biting his face. The exhaustion was constant. He replayed Mr. Collins' words in his head, the supervisor's disappointment cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. When he finally got home, the house was quiet. Latasha was at the table, sorting through papers. Tyrone saw the empty pill bottle again, now lying beside a stack of unpaid bills. He took off his jacket and sat down across from her. How was work? She asked without looking up. Fine, just, Tyrone replied. He glanced at the bills, then at Latasha. I'll figure it out, all right? She nodded, but her face stayed tense. We need those pills, Ty. The doctor said it's important I don't miss any doses. Tyrone reached across the table, taking her hand. I know, Tasha, I know. I'm going to make it work somehow. She looked up at him, her eyes tired but filled with trust. I know you will, she whispered. Tyrone gave her a small smile, though inside he felt the weight only growing heavier. He had promised to take care of them, and that meant finding a way, even when every road seemed blocked. As the night settled in, Tyrone lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft breaths of his family. He thought of the landlord's letter, Mr. Collins, warning Jamal's words. He closed his eyes and saw the old man again, saw the gratitude in his face. Tyrone clenched his jaw. The question echoing in his mind was doing the right thing always supposed to feel this hard? The morning would come soon enough, and with it, all the same problems. He knew that. But for now, he allowed himself a brief moment to breathe, just one quiet moment before it all began again. The alarm went off at 4 a.m., and Tyrone barely managed to drag himself out of bed. He had slept in short bursts, his mind replaying the events of the day before. The old man, Mr. Collins' words, Jamal's complaints. He shook his head, trying to clear it, and forced himself up, making his way into the tiny bathroom to splash water on his face. The coldness jolted him into some level of wakefulness. Latasha stirred when he walked back into the bedroom. She looked at him, her eyes half open, still tired. Morning, Ty, she murmured. Morning, Tasha, he said quietly. He kissed her forehead, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Go back to sleep. All right, she nodded, her eyes closing again. Tyrone put on his uniform, took one more look at his kids, and headed out. The cold morning air hit him hard as he stepped outside, but he welcomed it. He climbed into his truck, the familiarity of it almost comforting. Jamal was already there, leaning back in his seat. You gonna help every old dude you see today, too? Jamal muttered without even looking at Tyrone. Tyrone ignored the jab. He knew Jamal well enough to understand that the man just spoke his mind. Let's just get started, Tyrone said, turning on the engine. The morning moved slowly. Tyrone kept his head down, focused on keeping the truck on time, stopping and moving with precision. Jamal didn't say much. He was still salty about the delay from the day before, and Tyrone couldn't blame him. They were both just trying to get by, and delays meant trouble. Halfway through their route, Tyrone noticed a few of his other co-workers standing around in a small group. The street was filled with garbage cans ready to be emptied, but the men weren't working. They were chatting, their eyes occasionally shifting towards Tyrone. He could see the supervisor's car parked nearby too, which made the whole scene more confusing. What's that about? Tyrone muttered, more to himself than to Jamal. He pulled the truck over and got out, giving a nod to the group as he approached. Yo, Ty! One of them, Marcus, called out. He was smirking. Heard you were out there playing Good Samaritan yesterday. Tyrone stopped in his tracks, his expression tightening. Just helping someone who needed it, man? That's all. Marcus nudged the guy beside him, chuckling. Yeah. Heard Collins gave you a nice talk about it, too. Guess that's what you get for being a hero, right? Whatever, Marcus. I ain't in the mood, Tyrone replied, his voice flat. He turned his back on them, moving toward the garbage cans. He could hear them laughing behind him, their words mixed with the sound of the truck. Told you, man, Jamal said when Tyrone climbed back in. Ain't nobody going to appreciate you wasting time like that. Best just stick to the job. Tyrone stayed quiet, keeping his eyes on the road ahead. Jamal wasn't wrong, but that didn't make him feel any better about what he'd done. The old man had needed help, plain and simple. How could anyone just ignore that? As they continued on the route, they approached the spot where Tyrone had helped the old man the day before. He glanced down the street, half expecting to see the man again, struggling with his cart. Instead, the street was empty, quiet. Tyrone couldn't help but wonder if the old man was all right, if he'd gotten everything he needed after Tyrone had left. The truck rattled down the street and Tyrone forced his focus back to work, but the unease in his chest didn't leave. Hours later, as they neared the end of their route, Tyrone heard Jamal sigh in frustration. Damn, Ty! Collins is up ahead. Sure enough, Mr. Rock Collins was parked on the side of the road, standing outside his car with his arms crossed. Tyrone swallowed hard, his hands gripping the wheel tighter as he pulled the truck to a stop. He opened the door and stepped out, feeling his stomach twist. Collins, Tyrone greeted, trying to keep his voice steady. Tyrone, we need to have another talk, Mr. Collins said, his eyes narrowing. I've been hearing some complaints about you. Seems like some of your co-workers think you're slacking off. Tyrone clenched his jaw, the frustration bubbling up. I'm not slacking off, sir. I helped that man. Yeah, but I've been doing my job. Collins studied him for a moment, then let out a slow breath. Look, Tyrone, I get it. You're trying to do good, but I've got a job to do too. And if the guys are saying you're falling behind, I've got to take that seriously. Tyrone nodded, biting the inside of his cheek. Understood, sir. Collins stared at him for another moment before giving a nod. All right, just make sure it doesn't happen again. We've got enough trouble without falling behind. Tyrone nodded again, keeping his eyes on the ground. He didn't say anything else, just turned and headed back to the truck. Jamal watched him as he climbed in, but didn't say anything. They finished their shift in silence, the tension hanging in the air. When they pulled back into the depot, Jamal finally spoke up. You good, Ty? Tyrone nodded, though he wasn't sure if it was true. Yeah, just tired, man. Jamal gave a small shrug. Look, I get it. You're trying to do right, but you got to look out for yourself too, all right? Tyrone looked over at him, giving a small nod. Yeah, I hear you. He climbed out of the truck, heading for his own car. The drive home was quiet, the streets bathed in the orange glow of the setting sun. He parked in front of his apartment building and made his way up the stairs, the exhaustion from the day weighing down every step. When he walked in, Latasha was sitting at the kitchen table again. She looked up when she heard him, her face lighting up with a tired smile. Hey, Ty, how was it today? He gave her a weak smile. Same as always, just work. She gestured toward a pot on the stove. I made some stew. Devon and Kayla already ate. It's still warm if you want some. Tyrone's stomach growled at the mention of food. He walked over to the stove, grabbing a bowl and filling it with stew. He sat across from Latasha, eating in silence for a few moments. What's on your mind, Ty? She asked eventually, her eyes studying him. He looked at her, then down at his food. Just work stuff. Collins said some of the guys had been complaining, said I was slacking off. Latasha frowned. You slacking off? That doesn't make any sense. Tyrone shrugged. Guess they didn't like me helping that old man yesterday. Collins said I can't let it interfere with work. Latasha reached across the table, her hand resting on his. You did the right thing, Ty. Don't let anyone make you think different. He looked at her, feeling some of the tension ease. I know. It's just hard, you know? She nodded, her fingers squeezing his hand gently. I know, but we'll get through it. We always do. Tyrone finished his meal, then stood and washed the bowl in the sink. He glanced over at the stack of bills on the counter, his chest tightening again. He had to figure something out, and soon. Later that night, as he lay in bed, the words from Collins and his co-workers replayed in his head. He closed his eyes, trying to shut them out, but they wouldn't leave him alone. He thought about the old man again, how thankful he had looked. Tyrone wondered if he would ever see him again. Maybe he'd just disappear, like everyone else who needed help but couldn't afford to ask for it. The thought stayed with him, gnawing at the edge of his mind as sleep finally came, uneasy and restless. The alarm buzzed at 4 a.m., louder and harsher than ever, or at least it felt that way. Tyrone groaned as he reached over to silence it. He barely slept, the unease from yesterday still weighing on him, and he could feel it like a rock pressing down on his chest. He got up slowly, rubbing his face, trying to shake off the exhaustion that never seemed to leave. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt fragile, like it would break at any moment. He glanced over at Latasha, still asleep, her face relaxed. For once, he wanted her to rest, to not worry about things she couldn't control. He dressed quietly, slipped into the kitchen, and there it was, sitting right where he'd left it. The rent increase notice. Tyrone picked it up, reading it again. The words didn't change. The date didn't change. 30 days. He shook his head, folding the paper up and stuffing it into his back pocket. No point dwelling on it now. He stepped into the kids' room. Kayla was curled up on her bed, her long hair spread across the pillow. Devin lay sprawled out, mouth open, snoring lightly. Tyrone smiled. They were his reason for everything. In the truck, Jamal was already there, sipping a coffee. "Morning," Jamal said, giving Tyrone a side glance. "Morning," Tyrone answered, his voice tired. He started the truck, the engine coming to life with a low rumble. Jamal didn't push for more conversation, and Tyrone was grateful for that. They moved through the route like usual, lifting bins, emptying trash, moving on. Every action was routine, but Tyrone felt the weight of each one today more than ever. His body ached, his back hurt, and the cold nipped at his face. He could hear Marcus and the others behind them at a stop, still talking, still laughing. He ignored them. "Yo, T, you all right?" Jamal finally asked, breaking the silence. "Just tired, man." "Rough night," Tyrone said, keeping his eyes ahead, focused on the road. Jamal nodded, sipping his coffee. "Yeah, I hear you. Life don't stop for no one, right?" Tyrone just grunted in response. They continued on, but something kept itching at him. Maybe it was the notice in his pocket. Maybe it was the whispers from Marcus. Maybe it was Mr. Collins watching from a distance, waiting for another mistake. It all piled up. Near the end of their route, Jamal pointed ahead. "Ain't that the old man from the other day?" he said. Tyrone looked, his eyes squinting against the sun. There he was, the old man, standing by his front gate, staring at the street. Tyrone felt a pull in his chest. He slowed the truck, pulling to a stop beside him. "Hey there, sir," Tyrone called out from the window. The old man turned, his eyes lighting up with recognition. "Oh, it's you! You helped me with that cart." He shuffled over, his movement slow. Tyrone nodded, stepping out of the truck. Jamal stayed put, shaking his head but not saying anything. "Just wanted to check if you're all right," Tyrone said, his voice genuine. The old man smiled, his face creasing. "I'm fine, son, thanks to you. My name's Robert, by the way. Never got to tell you." "Tyrone," he said, extending his hand. Robert shook it, his grip weak but warm. "Not many folks stop to help an old man like him," Rob continued, his eyes soft. "I really do appreciate what you did." "It's no problem," Tyrone said. He looked over his shoulder. Jamal was watching, tapping his fingers on the dashboard. He could almost hear Mr. Collins's voice in his head warning him. "I should get going, though. Work to do, you know." Robert nodded, a look of understanding crossing his face. "Of course, son. You be safe out there. And thank you again." Tyrone gave a nod, climbing back into the truck. As they drove away, he looked in the rearview mirror, watching Robert until he disappeared around the corner. "You gonna make a habit out of this?" Jamal asked, raising an eyebrow. Tyrone sighed. "Just making sure he was all right. Nothing wrong with that." Jamal shook his head, but didn't push it. "Whatever, man. Just saying, you know Collins is on your ass already." Tyrone didn't respond. He knew. He knew all too well. When the route was finally done, they pulled back into the depot. Mr. Collins was there, his arms crossed, eyes narrowing as they pulled in. Tyrone felt his stomach twist. He stepped out of the truck, trying to keep his expression neutral. "Collins," he said, giving a small nod. "Tyrone, I need to talk to you," Mr. Collins said, his voice carrying that edge Tyrone had come to expect. "Yeah, what's up?" Tyrone tried to sound casual, but he felt his heart pounding in his chest. "Some of the guys are still complaining." Say you're not keeping up, that you're holding things up, Mr. Collins said, his eyes boring into Tyrone's. Tyrone clenched his jaw. I'm doing my job, you know that. Just because I helped someone once. Mr. Collins held up his hand. I get it. You think you're doing the right thing, but we have a job to do, Tyrone. If you keep falling behind, we're going to have a problem. Tyrone swallowed, nodding slowly. Understood, sir. Collins nodded, his face softening a bit. Just stay focused, all right? I don't want to have to write you up. Tyrone nodded again, watching as Collins walked away. He could feel Jamal's eyes on him, but he didn't turn around. He climbed into his car and left, the weight of it all pressing down on him. When he got home, Latasha was sitting at the table, staring at the stack of bills. She looked up when he walked in, her eyes tired. Hey, Ty, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Hey, Tasha, he replied, taking off his jacket. He walked over, standing beside her, looking down at the bills. We'll figure it out. She looked at him, her eyes glassy. They raised the rent again, Ty. I don't know how we're going to do it. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. I know, but I'm not giving up. I'll take on extra shifts if I have to. She nodded, but her face was still tight. She reached for the empty bottle of pills on the table. I'm going to need more of these too, she said quietly. Doctor said I can't skip any more doses. Tyrone felt a pang in his chest. I'll get them. Don't worry. I'll make it work. She reached over, taking his hand. I trust you, Ty. I know you're doing your best. He nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his best just wasn't enough. Not anymore. He was running out of options, and the walls were closing in faster than he could find a way out. That night, he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Latasha was asleep beside him, her breathing soft and uneven. The weight on his chest felt heavier than ever. He thought about the rent, the pills, Mr. Collins. He thought about Robert standing at the gate, his eyes full of gratitude. He had done the right thing, hadn't he? He closed his eyes, his body tense, his mind unable to quiet down. He needed a break, something to change, anything. He couldn't keep this up much longer. The alarm went off again, and Tyrone barely felt like he'd slept. He got up, dressed, kissed Latasha's forehead, and stepped out into the cold morning air. He was running on fumes, but he had no choice. There was no stopping now. As he climbed into the truck, Jamal looked at him, his brow furrowed. You look like hell, Ty. Tyrone gave a tired smile. Feels like it too. Jamal shook his head. Take care of yourself, man. Ain't nobody else gonna do it for you. Tyrone nodded, starting the engine. The cold metal of the steering wheel felt grounding, like it was the only thing holding him steady. He had to keep going, for Latasha, for Devin, for Kayla. He couldn't let them down. As they pulled away, Tyrone saw something out of the corner of his eye. A car parked at the depot, sleek and out of place. The driver stepped out, a man in a sharp suit looking around like he didn't belong there. Tyrone frowned, his eyes lingering on the man as they drove past. He had no idea who he was or why he was there, but something about it made Tyrone feel uneasy. He shook his head, focusing back on the road. Whatever it was, he'd deal with it when the time came. Right now, he just had to keep moving. Tyrone stepped out of his truck, the engine still rumbling behind him. He felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same dread he felt every time he saw Mr. Collins parked nearby. Except this time, Collins wasn't alone. There was that same car from earlier, shiny, new, the kind that had no business near the garbage depot. And there he was, the man in the suit, standing next to Collins. Tyrone could see their heads bent together talking. Who's that? Jamal muttered from behind him, his voice low. Ain't no inspector or nobody, is it? Tyrone shook his head, his brow furrowing. I don't know. I've never seen him before. He glanced back at Jamal, his partner still halfway out of the truck. Stay here. I'll see what's going on. Jamal snorted, leaning back. You better not get us into trouble again, Ty. Tyrone ignored him, walking toward Mr. Collins and the stranger. As he got closer, Collins noticed him, a look of mild surprise crossing his face before his usual frown settled in. Tyrone, Collins said, glancing at the man beside him. The stranger looked up, and his eyes locked onto Tyrone's with a strange mix of curiosity and recognition. Tyrone, that's you, right? The man said, stepping forward. He extended a hand, his smile easy and warm. I'm Robert. I think we've met. Tyrone blinked, caught off guard. It took him a second before he remembered the old man. He looked different, clean-shaven, his clothes sharp and professional. The frailness he remembered seemed almost gone. "Robert," Tyrone said, finally shaking his hand. "Yeah, we met the other day. I helped you with that cart." Robert nodded, still smiling. "You did more than that, son. You stopped when nobody else did. You helped when you didn't have to." Tyrone felt himself shift uncomfortably. He wasn't used to praise, especially from strangers. I mean, it was nothing, just trying to help. Collins cleared his throat, obviously out of the loop and uncomfortable. Tyrone, Mr. Robert here. He wanted to see you specifically. He's got something to talk to you about." Tyrone frowned, glancing at Robert. "Talk to me about what?" Robert smiled, a little more reserved now. "I was hoping we could have a quick word. I don't want to take up too much of your time. Just wanted to see if you'd hear me out." Tyrone hesitated. He could feel Mr. Collins watching him, probably waiting to see if he'd make another mistake. He could hear Jamal's voice in his head, warning him to be careful, to focus on the job. But the look in Robert's eyes wasn't something Tyrone could ignore. It was sincere, honest. "Sure, Mr. Robert," Tyrone finally said, giving a quick glance at Collins, who gave a stiff nod. "Take a few minutes, Tyrone. Just don't fall behind," Collins said, turning back toward his car. He gave Robert a polite nod before leaving them alone. Robert gestured towards the side of the depot, where it was quieter, away from the noise of the trucks and the men working. Tyrone followed him, the tension still tight in his chest. "So, what's this about?" Tyrone asked once they were away from the chaos. He kept his tone neutral, trying to understand what was going on. Robert smiled again, softer this time. "I owe you a thank you, Tyrone. You stopped to help me when I needed it, and I wanted you to know it didn't go unnoticed." Tyrone shifted again, rubbing the back of his neck. "Like I said, it was nothing, just doing what anyone would have done." Robert's expression turned serious. "No, not anyone would have done that. Most people didn't even look twice, but you did, and that's the kind of person I want in my company." Tyrone blinked, his brows drawing together. "Your company?" Robert nodded, pulling out a small business card from his pocket and handing it to Tyrone. It was crisp, the words printed in bold letters. Tyrone read them. "Robert Sinclair, CEO." "Your?" Tyrone began, his voice trailing off as he looked from the card to the man in front of him. It started to click. The car, the suit, the confidence. "Yeah, I own a company here in Oak Brook. Not the biggest, but we've been doing all right," Robert said, his voice modest. "And I think we could use someone like you." Tyrone looked at the card, then back at Robert, not really understanding. "I don't know. I don't know anything about business, Mr. Robert. I'm just a garbage man." Robert chuckled, shaking his head. "And that's exactly why I want you. You're honest, dependable, you've got character. My company's been looking for a supervisor for a new division we're opening. We need someone with the kind of dedication you've shown. And don't worry about the experience. We can teach that. It's the attitude I can't train." Tyrone stared, the words not fully sinking in. "A supervisor at your company?" Robert nodded, his expression sincere. "I know it's a lot to take in, and I don't expect an answer right now. I just wanted you to know the opportunity's there if you're interested. It comes with a better salary, benefits, health insurance for your family." Tyrone's heart skipped a beat at the mention of health insurance. He thought of Latasha, her face tight with pain, the empty pill bottles piling up. He thought of Devin and Kayla, and the rent increase that hung over them like a storm cloud. He swallowed hard, looking back at Robert. "Why me?" Tyrone finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Robert smiled. "Because you stopped. Because you cared when you didn't have to. That's the kind of person I want leading my team. Think about it, Tyrone. I know it's a big change, but sometimes big changes are exactly what we need." He handed Tyrone another card, this one with his personal number written on the back. "Call me if you're interested. And even if you're not, I still owe you a coffee sometime," Robert said, giving a small nod before turning to walk away. Tyrone stood there, staring at the card in his hand. The words blurred as he tried to process them. A job, a real job, health insurance. The weight of the offer seemed to crush him and lift him at the same time. Jamal called out from the truck, snapping Tyrone back to the present. "Yo, Ty, we got a job to do, man. Let's move." Tyrone slipped the card into his pocket, his fingers trembling slightly. He turned, heading back to the truck, his mind racing. Jamal watched him as he climbed in, raising an eyebrow. "What was all that about?" Jamal asked, his tone half curious, half wary. Tyrone hesitated, then shook his head. "Just someone I helped the other day. He wanted to say thanks." Jamal snorted. "Thanks, man? We're out here busting our asses and you're out here collecting thank yous? You gotta be careful, Ty." Tyrone didn't answer. He started the truck, the rumble of the engine filling the silence. But in his mind, all he could see was the card in his pocket. The words health insurance echoed over and over, and he felt the tightness in his chest shift, hope he hadn't felt in a long time. As they continued their route, Tyrone's mind kept drifting. He replayed Robert's words, trying to wrap his head around the possibility. It didn't seem real. Him, a supervisor? He could barely make ends meet now. How could he take on a role like that? But then he thought of Latasha, of Kayla and Devin, the pills, the rent. "Yo, Ty, you good?" Jamal asked, his voice breaking through Tyrone's thoughts. Tyrone glanced at him, then nodded. "Yeah, just got a lot on my mind." Jamal shook his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Don't get caught up in stuff that's going to mess you up, man. Keep your head down. Do the work. That's what we got to do." Tyrone nodded again, but the words felt hollow. Maybe keeping his head down wasn't enough anymore. Maybe it was time to look up to see what else might be out there. The card in his pocket felt heavy, like a lifeline. He had no idea if he'd take it, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like there was a choice. As the shift came to an end and the depot came back into view, Tyrone parked the truck and got out. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the pavement. Jamal gave him a quick nod before heading off, but Tyrone stayed for a moment, watching the other workers move around the depot. Tired faces, worn bodies. He pulled the card out of his pocket, staring at it. Robert's words came back to him. "Big changes are exactly what we need." Tyrone wasn't sure if he was ready for that change, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't keep going like this forever. Something had to give. He slipped the card back into his pocket, turned, and walked to his car. The day wasn't over yet, and neither was his fight. The card was still in Tyrone's pocket the next morning as the alarm blared at 4 a.m. It was an old habit. He never liked to leave anything important out in the open. But now, as he got up, there was something different. He took the card from his pocket, placed it on the table, and just stared at it. Robert Sinclair, CEO, it read. It was like a door that led somewhere else, but Tyrone wasn't sure if it was a door he had the courage to open. Latasha was already awake, sitting at the table with her cup of tea, rubbing her temples. Her eyes lifted from the tea to meet Tyrone's. "You're up early," she said, her voice soft. Tyrone nodded, setting the card down. He moved around the kitchen, making himself a quick cup of coffee. He took a deep breath, turned, and pushed the card towards her. "I got this yesterday." Latasha looked at the card, confusion in her eyes. She picked it up, her eyes scanning the words. "Robert Sinclair, CEO." "Who is this, Ty?" "He's that old man I helped the other day, the one with the cart," Tyrone explained, sitting down across from her. "Turns out he owns a company. Said he's got a job for me, a real job." Latasha's eyes widened. "What do you mean, a real job?" Tyrone took a deep breath. "A supervisor position. Said I got what it takes. Said he could teach me what I need to know. It's got a better salary, health insurance, all of it." Latasha blinked, and for a moment her eyes started to glisten. "Health insurance," she whispered. Tyrone nodded. "Yeah, for you, for the kids." "I don't know if it's real. I mean, it feels like a trick, you know? But he gave me his card. He said to call him if I wanted to talk more." Latasha put the card down, her hands trembling just a bit. "Ty, this could change everything. Or it could be nothing, Tasha. What if I can't do it? What if it's too much for me?" Tyrone said, the doubt leaking into his voice. He looked down at the table, his fingers tracing a scratch on the wood. "I don't know, Tasha. I don't know if I'm cut out for it." She reached across the table, her hand closing over his. "Ty, you're the hardest working man I know. You're smart. You've got more heart than anyone else. If anyone can do it, it's you. We've been praying for something like this for so long. Maybe this is it." Tyrone met her eyes, seeing the hope there, a hope he hadn't seen in a long time. "You really think I can do it?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "I know you can," she said, squeezing his hand. "Do it for us, for Devin and Kayla, for yourself." Tyrone nodded slowly, the tightness in his chest easing just a bit. He glanced at the clock. It was almost time for work. He stood, taking the card from her hand and putting it back in his pocket. "I'll call him," he said. "After today, I'll call him." Latasha smiled, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a spark in her eyes. "That's my Ty." Tyrone grabbed his jacket, kissed her on the forehead, and left for work. The cold morning air hit his face as he stepped outside. As he climbed into his truck, Jamal looked at him, raising an eyebrow. "You look different, man," Jamal said. "What's going on?" Tyrone smiled slightly. "Just got some things to figure out, that's all." Jamal snorted. "Hope it's good things. Could use some good news around here." Tyrone nodded, starting the truck, the engine roaring to life. They moved through their route, the same routine as every day. Bins, trash, move on. But Tyrone felt lighter. Even as they worked, he thought about Robert's offer, about what it could mean for his family, about Latasha's face when she heard the words health insurance. He hadn't realized how much she needed that hope, how much he did too. The day went by faster than Tyrone expected. There were still the looks from Marcus and the others, the whispers, but Tyrone didn't pay them any attention. For the first time in a while, it felt like their opinions didn't matter. Mr. Collins was there too, his watchful eyes following them, but even that didn't weigh on him as much as before. As they finished the route and pulled back into the depot, Jamal looked over at Tyrone, his expression more serious now. "You sure you're good, Ty?" Jamal asked. Tyrone nodded. "Yeah, Jamal, I think I'm finally good." Jamal nodded, though he still looked skeptical. "All right, just don't go getting yourself into anything crazy." Tyrone gave a small laugh. "No promises, man." When he got back home, Latasha was waiting. She was standing at the kitchen counter, her fingers tapping against the surface. When Tyrone walked in, she turned to face him, her eyes wide. "Well?" she asked, her voice filled with anticipation. Tyrone took a deep breath, pulling the card out of his pocket. He looked at it for a moment, then at Latasha. "I'm calling him now," he said. He walked over to the phone, his fingers trembling just a bit as he dialed the number. Latasha stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, her breath held. The phone rang once, twice, and then there was a click. "This is Robert Sinclair," came the voice on the other end. "Mr. Robert, it's Tyrone." "Tyrone from the other day," Tyrone said, his voice shaking a little. There was a pause, then Robert's voice came back, warm and clear. "Tyrone, I'm glad you called. I was hoping you would." Tyrone swallowed, his heart pounding. "I've been thinking about what you said about the job." Robert's voice brightened. "I'm glad to hear that. Why don't we meet tomorrow? Talk it through? I'll answer any questions you have." Tyrone nodded, though Robert couldn't see him. Yeah, that sounds good." Robert gave him the details, place, time, and then they hung up. Tyrone put the phone down, turning to Latasha. She was smiling, her eyes filling with tears. "You did it, Ty," she whispered. "You really did it." Tyrone pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her. He could feel the tension in her shoulders, the weight they both carried, but in that moment it felt like it was starting to lift, even if just a little. The next day came quickly. Tyrone woke up feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, nervous. Not the kind of nervous that came from fear, but the kind that came from possibility. He dressed in the best clothes he had. Nothing fancy, but clean and pressed. Latasha gave him a hug before he left, her eyes full of pride. "You got this, Ty," she said, her voice steady. Tyrone nodded, giving her a small smile. "I hope so." He arrived at the address Robert had given him, a small office building, neat and clean, with a modest sign that read Sinclair Holdings. He took a deep breath before stepping inside, his hands feeling sweaty. The receptionist looked up, smiling politely. "You must be Mr. Tyrone. Mr. Sinclair is expecting you," she said, gesturing toward the door. Tyrone nodded, following her directions, his heart pounding. He stepped into the office, and there was Robert standing by a desk, smiling. "Tyrone, glad you could make it," Robert said, walking over and extending his hand. Tyrone shook it, his grip firm despite his nerves. "Thank you for giving me the chance, Mr. Robert." Robert gestured for Tyrone to sit, and they both took a seat. The office was simple but comfortable, with a few pictures on the walls and a large window letting in the morning light. "So, Tyrone," Robert began, leaning forward, "I know this is a big step, and I want you to know I'm not just offering this on a whim. I see something in you, dedication, character, and I think those qualities are exactly what my company needs. Tyrone swallowed, nodding. I appreciate that, sir. I don't know if I'm really cut out for something like this. Robert smiled. I'm not worried about that. We all start somewhere, Tyrone. And what I see in you is the most important thing, heart. Everything else we can teach. They spoke for what felt like hours, about the job, the responsibilities, what Tyrone would need to learn. Robert was patient, answering every question, never rushing. By the end of it, Tyrone felt ready. He could see the path ahead, not all of it, but enough to take the first step. Robert stood, extending his hand once again. So what do you say, Tyrone? Ready to take a chance? Tyrone looked at his hand, then back at Robert's face. He thought of Latasha, of Devin and Kayla, of all the nights they'd spent trying to make ends meet. He reached out, shaking Robert's hand firmly. Yeah, Tyrone said, his voice steady. I'm ready. The sun was barely over the horizon when Tyrone stood in front of his mirror, adjusting his collar. His best button-down shirt was a bit tight around the neck. He hadn't worn it since Devin's school ceremony last year. He turned, examining his reflection. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was enough to make him look presentable. He nodded to himself, then grabbed his jacket from the bed. Latasha walked in, her eyes bright despite the early hour. You look good, Ty. Real good, she said, her smile warm. Tyrone turned to her, his heart pounding. You think I'm ready for this, Tasha? She stepped closer, placing her hands on his shoulders. You were born ready. You just didn't have the chance. Now you do. Tyrone nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He kissed her forehead before grabbing his bag. All right, I gotta go. She followed him to the door. Devin and Kayla were both standing there with groggy smiles. Go get him, Dad, Devin said, giving a thumbs up. Yeah, Dad, you got this, Kayla added, her voice still thick with sleep. Tyrone chuckled, shaking his head. All right. You two get ready for school. Don't give your mom a hard time. You hear? The kids nodded, and Tyrone stepped outside. The crisp morning air hit his face. The streets were quiet as he drove toward the office, Sinclair Holdings. It was such a different feeling from the garbage route, the kind of day that made him feel out of place. But there was a determination in him now that he hadn't felt in a long time. When he walked through the front doors, he was greeted by the same receptionist as the day before. She smiled at him, her tone polite and friendly. Good morning, Mr. Tyrone. Mr. Sinclair is in his office waiting for you. Thank you, Tyrone replied, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding. He walked to Robert's office, knocking softly on the door. It swung open, and there was Robert, smiling broadly. Tyrone, welcome! Come in! Come in! Tyrone stepped inside, taking in the office, a bit less intimidating in the daylight. Robert gestured to a chair, and Tyrone sat, his hands resting in his lap. How are you feeling this morning? Robert asked, leaning back in his chair. Nervous, sir, Tyrone admitted, his voice honest. This is all. It's a lot. Robert smiled, nodding. It's supposed to be. Change is never easy, Tyrone, but I'm here to help you every step of the way. Today, I'll introduce you to some of the team, and we'll go over some basics. All right? Tyrone nodded. Sounds good. Robert stood, gesturing for Tyrone to follow. Come on, let's get started. They moved through the office, Robert pointing out different departments. The people were friendly, some waving as they passed by, others nodding politely. It was all so different, clean, organized. Tyrone couldn't help but feel out of place, but he kept his chin up, trying to absorb everything. They stopped by a small office, and Robert knocked on the door before stepping in. This is Peter, he said, gesturing to the man inside. Peter, this is Tyrone. He's joining us as a supervisor. Peter stood, his handshake firm. He looked to be around Tyrone's age, his face kind with a gentle smile. Welcome aboard, Tyrone. We're glad to have you. Thank you, Peter. I'm looking forward to getting started, Tyrone replied, his voice a bit shaky. Peter nodded. I've corrected spelling and adjusted some punctuation for readability and flow. No worries. We'll take it one step at a time. If you need anything, I'm right here. Robert gave Tyrone a reassuring pat on the back. Peter will help you get settled. He'll walk you through some of the systems and get you familiar with our operations. Tyrone nodded, feeling the tension ease just a bit. Peter seemed approachable, the kind of person he could go to without feeling judged. Robert left them, and Peter gestured for Tyrone to sit. All right, Tyrone. First thing we'll do is get you set up with an ID badge and access to the systems, Peter said, his tone casual. Tyrone watched as Peter moved with ease, navigating through paperwork and computer screens. The terms, the processes, all of it was new, but Peter didn't seem to mind Tyrone's questions. He took the time to explain, his patience easing Tyrone's nerves. After a couple of hours, Peter stood, giving Tyrone a smile. Why don't we take a break? You're doing great so far, and I think a cup of coffee would do us both good. Tyrone chuckled, nodding. I could use one. They made their way to the break room, the smell of fresh coffee filling the air. A couple of other employees were there, chatting quietly. Tyrone felt their eyes on him, but Peter made the introductions, his friendly demeanor putting Tyrone at ease. So, Tyrone, Peter said once they were seated, their cups steaming in front of them. Robert told me a bit about how you two met. Pretty wild, huh? Tyrone smiled, shaking his head. Yeah, wild is one word for it. I didn't think helping a man with his groceries would lead to all this. Peter nodded, a grin on his face. Life's funny that way, isn't it? Sometimes it's the smallest things that end up changing everything. Tyrone took a sip of his coffee, feeling the warmth spread through him. I guess so. I just hope I can do a good job here. I don't want to let anyone down. Peter's expression softened. Look, man, we've all been where you are, feeling like we don't belong, worried we're going to mess it up. But you've got this. Just take it day by day. Tyrone nodded, letting Peter's words sink in. Maybe he was right. Maybe he didn't need to have it all figured out today. Just one step at a time. The rest of the day went by in a blur. More introductions, more systems to learn, more paperwork. It was overwhelming, but Peter stayed by his side, guiding him through each step. By the time the clock hit 5, Tyrone felt exhausted, but it was a different kind of exhaustion. Not the kind that left him feeling drained and hopeless, but the kind that came from learning, from doing something new. Peter clapped him on the shoulder as they were leaving. You did great today, Tyrone. Tomorrow we'll get into some of the real work, but you're off to a good start. Thanks, Peter. I appreciate all the help, Tyrone said, his gratitude genuine. No problem. We're in this together, Peter replied, giving him a nod before heading off. Tyrone walked out of the building, the cool evening air hitting his face. He looked up at the sky, the sun dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He felt a small smile tugging at his lips. It was his first day, and it hadn't been perfect, but he had made it through. When he got home, Latasha was waiting, her eyes bright with anticipation. So, how was it? She asked, her voice full of excitement. Tyrone set his bag down, a tired but genuine smile on his face. It was a lot, but it was good. I think this might actually work out. She threw her arms around him, holding him tight. I knew you could do it, Ty. I'm so proud of you. He held her close, closing his eyes. The worries weren't all gone. There were still bills, still challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe things were starting to change. Maybe he could give his family the life they deserved. Kayla and Devin came running in, both of them talking at once, asking questions about his day. Tyrone laughed, ruffling Devin's hair. One at a time, he said, shaking his head. He sat down with them, telling them about the office, about Peter, about the coffee machine that actually made good coffee. Their eyes were wide, filled with wonder at this new chapter in their dad's life. That night, as Tyrone lay in bed with Latasha resting beside him, he felt a peace he hadn't known in years. It wasn't perfect, and there was still a long way to go, but he was ready for it, ready for the next day, the next challenge. The alarm would still go off at 4 a.m., but it wouldn't be for the garbage truck. It would be for something new, something he chose, and that made all the difference. The alarm buzzed at 4 a.m. like it always did, but Tyrone wasn't getting up to haul trash today. He turned it off and laid back for a moment, staring at the ceiling. This was his new routine now, and it still felt strange. He could hear Latasha breathing softly beside him, the room dark except for the faint light from the window. He took a deep breath and swung his legs over the side of the bed. It was time to get moving. He went through his morning ritual, dressing in his neatly pressed clothes, eating a quick breakfast with Latasha, and getting the kids up for school. The routine was the same, but there was something new about the energy in the house. Latasha smiled more. The kid seemed excited about his job, asking questions that he couldn't always answer, but that made him feel proud. He kissed them goodbye before heading out to the car. The drive to Sinclair Holdings was quiet, the sun just starting to rise. He parked outside the small building and walked inside, feeling the familiar weight of nerves settling in his stomach. It was only his second week, and there was so much to learn. Yesterday, Peter had said they would be diving into the more complicated parts of the job, supervising tasks, managing reports, real responsibilities. Tyrone wasn't sure if he was ready. Inside, Peter greeted him with his usual friendly smile. "Morning, Tyrone. You ready to hit the ground running today?" Tyrone nodded, though the tightness in his chest hadn't eased. "Morning, Peter. Yeah, let's do it." Peter clapped him on the shoulder. "That's the spirit. We'll start with a meeting with the team. I want you to get familiar with everyone's roles and responsibilities. It makes it easier to understand how we fit all the pieces together." Tyrone followed Peter to the conference room, where a few of the other supervisors were already seated. They greeted Tyrone politely, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being the odd one out. They all spoke in a language he was still struggling to understand. Terms and processes that were new to him, responsibilities that felt far more complex than anything he'd dealt with before. He took a seat and tried to keep up. Peter led the meeting, talking through reports and assignments. Tyrone found himself nodding along, but half the words seemed to blur together. He could feel his palms growing damp as he scribbled notes, the fear of making a mistake gnawing at him. When Peter called on him to share his thoughts on a plan they had discussed the day before, Tyrone hesitated. "I think we should maybe focus more on keeping everyone on schedule," Tyrone said, his voice uncertain. The others nodded, but Peter's smile was slightly strained. "Good thought, Tyrone. We'll work on it together," Peter said before moving on. The meeting ended, and Tyrone stood to leave, his chest feeling heavy. He hadn't gotten it. He hadn't said what Peter wanted to hear. He could feel the eyes of the other supervisors on him, polite but questioning. Peter caught up with him as they left the room. "Don't sweat it, Tyrone. You're doing fine. It's a lot to take in at first, but you'll get the hang of it." Tyrone nodded, but the worry didn't leave. "Thanks, Peter. I don't want to let anyone down." Peter's expression softened. "I get that, trust me, but no one expects you to be perfect out of the gate. It takes time. You've got what it takes, Tyrone. You just have to believe it." Tyrone gave a small smile, though he didn't quite feel it. He wanted to believe it, but the gap between where he was and where he needed to be felt huge. He followed Peter to the office, and they spent the rest of the morning reviewing reports. It was slow going, but Peter was patient, explaining each step and answering Tyrone's questions. By lunch, Tyrone's head was spinning, but he felt like he'd learned something, even if just a little. They took a break in the break room, Peter chatting with a few of the others while Tyrone sat quietly drinking his coffee. He listened to their conversations, things about quarterly numbers, project schedules, performance reviews. It all sounded so foreign. He could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him again, the fear that maybe he was out of his depth.